If you had told me at the beginning of the year that one of the best things I was going to read in 2025 was a collection of short stories, I probably wouldn't believe you. And yet here we are. Oh my god. This was so good. Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we are going to be talking about The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, a collection of short stories, pretty short too, like 20, 30 pages for most of them. One or two of them are more in the 100-page ballpark, but most of these are pretty short. And I'm not a huge short fiction person for the most part. At least that's what I always think, and I'm not sure why I think that, because I've actually read some really incredible short stories throughout my life, but when I go to read for pleasure and entertainment, I tend to think of novels, or maybe a manga series or something, but usually I'm thinking of long-form fiction. I guess it just feels like short stories aren't going to be as satisfying, right? They're so short. Like, how can 20 to 30 pages deliver the same impact that a 500-page fantasy novel or a series, a 5-book series or whatever? That's just kind of the way it feels, but I don't think that's always true. And certainly after reading this, I think I'm realizing that I really like short fiction. Obviously, it needs to be well written. I'm sure there's varying ranges of quality for short stories, just like there are for novels. And so that's probably a key here. I have a suspicion that even if I read a bunch of other short story collections, this will remain near or at the top. So there is that. But I'm so glad I decided to fit this into my reading schedule because this was so incredible. I can't believe how good it is. Now, let me start with my introduction to Ken Liu, the author. The first thing I read that he worked on was actually The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu, which is, everybody knows what that is at this point. There was a Netflix show for it. And he was the translator, because that's a Chinese science fiction novel. Ken Liu translated it to English and did a very capable job. That's the first time I heard of him. And then the next thing I really heard about was the Dandelion Dynasty, which is an epic fantasy series, which I love epic fantasy, so I tend to be in the know of whatever's happening there. A couple of years ago, I read the first book, The Grace of Kings, and it was my favorite book of 2023. I absolutely loved it. It somehow felt like a historical novel, but also a fantasy novel. Kind of, the term silk punk is used. Is really cool, really interesting epic fantasy novel that is setting the stage for the rest of the Dandelion Dynasty, which I still need to get to my shame. I love that first book, and I'm such an ADHD reader that I go all over the place. But I really loved that first book in the Dandelion Dynasty, and I knew that was one of those things where I read that first book and I was like, yeah, I'm going to complete this series, and I'm probably going to try a bunch of other stuff by this author. Skip forward to today. I've actually heard about this a couple of times, The Paper Menagerie, and I was intrigued because Ken Liu was so good that I was willing to consider a collection of short stories. The other thing I noticed, though, is The Grace of Kings. The way that book is structured is almost like a collection of short stories that make up one epic fantasy novel. It's kind of zoomed out, more so than a lot of modern day epic fantasy, where you tend to follow really closely with a couple of POV characters. The Grace of Kings, very much, you have a couple of primary characters, but a lot of it feels more omniscient, or kind of like reading something like Dune, where you're just kind of an eagle-eye view of this huge conflict and kind of spanning this whole continent as things happen over the course of several years or a decade or something like that. It's really zoomed out, and he manages to deliver a lot of emotion and amazing character work even within that kind of distance. But that is one thing I noticed, is that story has so many different characters with this nation spanning epic fantasy that involves all of these different tribes and kingdoms across the continent, and you follow perspectives from a lot of different people. And so it felt like you were often reading 10, 15, 20, 30-page short stories, vignettes of this or that kind of formed a mosaic that made up The Grace of Kings. Now, I've heard the later books in that series get a bit more modern in their structure, but what I walked away from that book knowing was that Ken Liu has the ability to use a really short form style of writing to get me hyper engaged with a character, with a situation, and to deliver a huge amount of world building, setting, plot, and emotional gut punch, even within short periods of time, within a short amount of pages. And so that's what made me feel like I think I'm going to like his short stories, even though I tend to prefer novels. So that's the setup. That's how I decided to read this. And then I had seen one or two reviews on this more recently, and I saw it at the bookstore. I picked it up, and lo and behold, it was amazing. So the way I read this too is I decided I would read one short story per day. And that was kind of a fun way to fit it into my reading, is it didn't take too much away from some of the other bigger novels I'm reading, like Sun Eater right now, while still making progress. And I think I read this in the span of about 2 weeks, because I don't know, there's like 12 to 14 short stories in here. One or two of them are a little longer. Like there's one or two stories that took me longer than a day, but most of them you can knock out in like 20 minutes. So I don't want to give away too much about the various short stories, but I will say a lot of them are kind of sci-fi focused. Some of them are more near term. Some of them span a little farther into the future. There's a few in here that are more historical fiction or even historical fantasy. And then some of the sci-fi is very modern day, in a sense of like exploring technologies that could exist, if not now, pretty soon, and exploring what the social consequences of some of these technologies would be. And I have to say, one of the things that really impresses me about Liu's work is that he is really good at looking at real technologies or technologies that there is a lot of hypothetical framework for, like actual theoretical technologies that have some basis in potential reality. And he often will cite his sources too. Like you'll read a short story. One of the short stories in this is like a detective story. And there is a technology where the Wi-Fi signals can like bounce off people in a room or a building, and kind of you can recreate the way those signals bounce to kind of know who, like roughly like the size of a person who was in that room at that time, and how they move. You can kind of like recreate a scene in the abstract, and that just sounded cool to me, but I didn't assume there was any basis for reality for that. But then at the end of that short story, Ken Liu cites a source of that is a technology that is maybe kind of possible. I don't know exactly how possible, but like it's something that there's been research on, and that it's stuff like that where you're like, wow. And that adds to this realness to the storytelling, this sense of immersion of really feeling the consequences of the technology, because it feels very plausible. A lot of his technology is like utter magic and yet very plausible. And so then when he takes it and looks at how would people react, and like how would this be integrated into our daily lives, it starts to become so much more impactful, because you can see yourself in a world where that's happening. And often some of his short stories are critiquing the way like tech companies and governments and corporations use technologies. And some of those things are just things we are dealing with now. And so, he's one of those writers where he explores these things really well, and in a way that can be a little concerning because it feels so realistic, but it's so good. Ultimately, though, I think Ken Liu is really strong at understanding the human element of his stories. And that's why when he looks at the social consequences of the various technologies he explores in these short stories, you can really see how he looks at humanity, but he often looks at humanity at scale, and then he will sometimes zoom into individual characters. And so you kind of are going between nations and empires and like, you know, structures of power, and then you're looking at individual characters and kind of seeing how these things are playing out. And there were some tear jerkers in here. There's a couple that got me like actually choked up, which is fairly rare for me. I sometimes will choke up when reading, but it's not super common. And a couple of stories in here got me where my eyes were misty, and I had to like put the book down and collect myself a little bit. And, you know, after reading one of them, one of my kids came in and you know, they're like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm fine." But that's the type of writing this is. And some of his short stories are a little bit mind blowing too, where it's, you don't quite know how he's going to pull off either the plot or the emotive element. And when he does, it's just really satisfying. And then some of his stories, you do know how they're going to play out, very much so. You can tell what he's building towards. There's one short story in here called Mono No Aware, is one of the ones that got me. And I fairly early on, I knew how this, like, once the initial kind of situation of that short story is set up, I kind of figured out what was going to happen. But the way he did it, the way he told it, the specific prose he used, and the character beats he used to convey this story, and the fact that he made you live this thing that you kind of knew it was happening, but it was heartbreaking and heroic and beautiful, and you get to the end of it and it's like, I kind of knew it was going to happen, yeah, that's what happened, and it devastated me, and it was beautiful, and it was so good. One of the short stories in here dealt with real historical atrocities that happened in Japan during World War II. And Unit 731, which careful if you look that up because it's graphic and depressing and horrifying. He explores this real world tragedy that happened in World War II, and he introduces a really cool sci-fi concept that layers over that and allows him to talk about this event and how various governments and human factions reacted to this, and the way governments often repress and try and bury awful things they do for the sake of moving forward, for the sake of patriotism and unification of the nation, and wanting to feel good about whatever country you're a part of. And he looks at kind of the lie of history that a lot of governments lean into, and the way we tend to not always know the true story of these awful things that do happen. And I think one of the through lines of this book, one of the themes that I love, is his idea that we need stories of real people to connect emotionally with the things that have happened in the past, to understand how to have a better future as humanity. And often various governments and factions and powerful people will want to repress that because it is not ideal for them. And even in like the academic and scholar sector, like historians want to try and be very data driven and very unbiased in how they evaluate what actually happened. And so a lot of times, stories that people tell cannot be fully taken as fact. But he kind of brings out this great point that, like, when we get too analytical, we start to remove that human element. And sometimes we need the individual stories of people, in all of their bias, in all of their flawed recollection, to really emotionally connect with ourselves as a species, and to understand ourselves. And so, it's so good. It's so beautiful and poignant. And I've been thinking about this every day since I started reading it. Like, when I'm not reading it, I'm just thinking about it. And now that I finished it, I'm kind of bummed out that it's over. But like, I just keep thinking about some of these different stories and the questions they raise about what it means to be a human, and what it means to tell stories and hear stories, and the importance of storytelling. And obviously I'm a reader, so I'm a sucker for stories and books, but I think Ken Liu taps into why stories, individual people's stories, are so crucial, truly crucial, not just in a self-congratulatory, we're readers and authors, we love stories, but like, stories are what makes us human. And when we abstract into the world of data too much, when we look at big data and analytics, we start to become just numbers in a spreadsheet. And we see that today with corporations and governments, where they treat humans as numbers in a spreadsheet, and it's harmful. And we see a lot of pain and grief from that. And it kind of starts to remove our humanity, not just for the people in the spreadsheet, but for the people at the top. They kind of remove themselves from an element of their humanity. So anyway, I'm going off on a huge tangent here, but I love the themes and the questions raised in this book, and I thought it was handled so brilliantly, and I loved just about every story. And the stories that I didn't love, I still liked. Like, I would say I adored over half of these, if not 3/4 of them. And like I said, the other quarter of stories or so were still good and enjoyable and thought-provoking. Like, there weren't any bad ones, really. Like, this was a great, great short story collection. So, I highly recommend The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. For a collection of short stories, I would give this a 9.5, maybe even a 10. I'm bad at choosing numerical ratings, and I haven't decided if I'm going to make that a thing on my channel yet, but I'd go with a 9.5 for how powerful this was. Maybe a 10. I don't know. This was great. I go get this. Go read this. If you love short fiction and you love sci-fi, this is a no-brainer. Even if you don't, this is worth trying. I'm not the biggest short fiction reader, and this is probably going to be one of my favorite things that I read this year. This is going to be one of the books that I probably remember a long time from now, and I'm going to be recommending it to everybody. So go check this out. And, because it's short stories, again, you can just do one a day. It's easy, 20 minutes a day, and you'll get through the short story collection in a couple of weeks, and you'll be all the better for it. You're going to thank me. I promise you. You're going to come back, and you're going to be like, thank you so much. Or maybe you've already read it, and you're like, yeah, I totally get it. So let me know in the comments, what did you think about The Paper Menagerie? The good, the bad, let me know all of it. And as always, thanks so much for watching. It's great to have you here and chat about books, and we'll see you next time.